right, you should be good to go, Senator.
Thank you. Just wanted to call this hearing for PSTE to order. I'd just like to first start by acknowledging my colleagues. Just welcome back to Senator Edwards, Senator Johnny Ray Sailing. We also acknowledge that we are joined by a new committee member, and just wanted to lift him up. We're joined by the good senator from District 27, Senator Mike Jackson. So welcome to the subcommittee, Senator Jackson. At this moment, we'll be hearing today to get the Chesapeake Bay overview. I would like to start by just recognizing our budget analyst, Andrew Gray. And Andrew Gray, we can get started whenever you are.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You should be seeing the first page of the Chesapeake Bay Overview analysis. This reflects the funding for overall Chesapeake Bay Restoration funding as notified by the administration. It reflects around a $542.1 million decrease between fiscal 22 and fiscal 23. This is largely due to the Purple Line Activities project. This is a Maryland Department of Transportation project. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It's not due to any fundamental change in terms of the overall work for the Bay. It's just a matter of timing in terms of that particular project, which takes up a lot of the funding. In terms of the Chesapeake Bay restoration work, there's the Chesapeake Bay total maximum daily load, just the diet for the Bay for nutrients and sediment. That's nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. And then in terms of how we're going to get there, there are watershed implementation plans for each state and jurisdiction involved in the partnership. And then there are 2-year milestones which break up those watershed implementation plans for more immediate understanding of how the states are doing in terms of their nutrient and sediment reductions. Exhibit 1 reflects the information about the nitrogen pollution, phosphorus, and sediment pollution reductions required for Maryland. Exhibit 2 reflects information as of 2019. This information has not been updated due to some model changes, but this does reflect the kind of big picture look at how we're doing over the entire watershed. What you're seeing there, once I adjust the screen, is the predominant loading source on the far left is agriculture in the watershed, and that's the light green that you're seeing throughout most of the states. The middle part of this exhibit reflects the information about the progress to date as of 2019. What you really want to see is a lot of dark green or blue, but we're not seeing that yet. We're seeing a lot of the segments have not had the sufficient progress to meet the goals. Now, on the far right, what you're seeing is for nitrogen. This is the loading reduction remaining. What you're seeing is sort of this interesting crescent kind of feature coming from kind of the Virginia, sort of Shenandoah River Valley up into the kind of Lancaster County kind of agricultural area of Pennsylvania, and a little bit north of that as well. And then over on the eastern shore of Maryland, there's a lot of agriculture too. So that's kind of your general work that still needs to be done. In terms of the kind of the overall loading and what Maryland's trying to do, Exhibit 4 reflects the information by sector. And what you're seeing here is substantial progress since 2009. The 2020 actual is actually around 4 million pounds lower than 2019. So that's impressive work for the last couple of years. The target then looks attainable based on that trajectory. Now, one of the things to consider here is that the Maryland's original plan was to actually go well below the target of 45.8 million pounds of nitrogen. They were hoping to get around 44.7 million pounds, which is called the 2025 WIP goal official. New information as of 2019 indicated, though, that Maryland's plan would reduce loads down to 45.5 million pounds per year, which is a little bit less of a cushion than originally had been planned for. Looking forward, a lot of the work is going to be needed in the agriculture sector. And the concern here is that the agriculture sector has not had the same kind of reduction over the 2009 to 2020 period as it needs to for the 2020 to 25 period. That's a 6.5% reduction from 2009 to 2020, but then they're going to need to ramp up production, 18.5% reduction over that next time period. Now, in terms of the loading, nitrogen loading by basin, you see the information here reflects same overall total 45.8 million target, and that we're fairly close to that 48 million pounds. I'd just like to draw your attention to the information for the Eastern Shore. So the Eastern Shore still has around 12.1% reduction that needs to do between 2020 and 25. which means it has to ramp up that work that's been doing. It's only had a 7.4% reduction in nitrogen between 2009 and 2020. This is another note. University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science has 2 measurements that it does for Chesapeake Bay related loadings. It looks at the bay itself in terms of how it's doing, and it also looks at the watershed. This is a recent measure report card that it's been doing as last 2 years now. And that recent report card reflects that the Choptank River area, kind of watershed, had the lowest level or had the turbidity was the highest level in the watershed, and had the lowest level of civic engagement. So that's on the eastern shore of Maryland. So just a couple of things to keep in mind. Finally, you have the Chesapeake Bay overall nitrogen loads. This has been the overall for the states. And just draw your attention here to the District of Columbia has already met its 2025 target. And then Pennsylvania still has quite a ways to go. It's going to need to ramp up reduction of its loading significantly in order to be able to meet that 2025 target. And even as things stand, it looks like the plans overall do not meet the 2025 target, at least as of the 2019 information and the official kind of goal as of 2025. First issue concerns the administration signaling support for pay for performance plans and private conservation financing. So this is an important change. This is a possibility that was proposed in last session, Senate Bill 737. It provided for a broad variety of existing programs related to environmental conservation, natural resources management, and would have provided for private investment for, say, environmental projects and markets and pay for performance procurement. So that bill was not passed. It appears to be largely reintroduced as Senate Bill 348 in the 2022 session, though. So the governor's plans based on kind of supporting that bill were based at least partially perhaps on a report that came out, Private Conservation Finance to Chesapeake Bay's Global Lead and How to Expand It. There are a couple of notes here in terms of what can be done in the watershed in terms of kind of expanding conservation finance, private conservation finance, in terms of procurement, shifting procurement to an outcomes-based model. So instead of it just paying for practices and assuming that we get the reductions of nutrients and sediment, you would actually pay for outcomes. So the private sector would take on the burden of doing the reductions, and then the state would only pay for that reduction once it was proven to have occurred. There's also the idea of green infrastructure valuation, trying to incorporate natural capital and green infrastructure assets into local budgeting and zoning decisions and offset policies. There's the idea of expanding public-private partnerships, or P3s. One example of this in Maryland, at least, is the Corvia Solutions arrangement with Prince George's County for stormwater remediation work. And then finally, there's the idea for environmental impact offsetting. And the idea, at least in the report, is to try to move away from a government model of being involved in the payments for offsets and just have that be a kind of private to private enterprise. Now, one kind of outcome-based component that DLS is highlighting here is the cover crop plus option that's been discussed recently by the Soil Health Advisory Committee within the Maryland Department of Agriculture. And the idea there would to provide for potentially outcome-based payments, perhaps over a 5-year period, and perhaps including also additional crops or species of crops for cover crop payments. The Department of Legislative Services recommends the administration discuss the possibility of an outcome-based payment system for the cover crop program. Moving now to the second recommendation or second issue, this is the overall Chesapeake Bay restoration funding. What you're seeing here once again is that $542.1 million decrease between the 2 years. That once again largely reflects the funding for the purple line activities. My understanding is that there has been some more stability recently in terms of the financing plan and kind of the work that will be done, but the fluctuations in the uncertainty about that plan have modified the overall funding that's reflected for the Chesapeake Bay restoration as well. In terms of some of the large increases in funding between the 2 years, it was $56.3 million for a lot of the transfer tax related conservation programs, Program Open Space, Rural Legacy, and MALF. That's due to the funding increase in the revenue and also an overattainment from the 2 years prior in fiscal 21. And that funding is then reflected in fiscal 23. There's a $9.1 million increase for the Department of Natural Resources, primarily reflects around $13.4 million for oyster restoration purposes. And then while not reflected well in this exhibit, Maryland Department of the Environment does have a number of movements in terms of its financing and funding for environmental programs. There's the $20 million for the Clean Water Commerce Act, and that's in both fiscal 22 and fiscal 23. A recent budget amendment was processed for that purpose in fiscal 22. There's also $25 million that's not reflected in this exhibit, but it is in the budget for the Conowingo Dam Watershed Implementation Plan. And then also not reflected in this exhibit is Maryland Environmental Service dredging funding for the Conowingo Dam is $6 million there as well. Now, the kind of final component here is once again the Maryland Department of Transportation funding as discussed. Department of Legislative Services recommends that the administration continue to provide this information that feeds this exhibit. In addition, perhaps to include language on Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bay's 2010 Trust Fund annual reporting as well, in order to be able to have that information next year for this presentation. Third issue concerns historical and projected historic Chesapeake Bay restoration spending. So last year, there's a request for information, or Section 21 of the bill actually restricted funding for information about the overall Chesapeake Bay restoration efforts. That report reflects two main factors that I can understand in terms of how the Bay is doing. There are the short-term impacts in terms of the overall plan, and then long-term. So the two short-term impacts are wastewater treatment plant failures at Patapsco and Back River, excuse me. So those plants had some operations and structural challenges that meant that they were not meeting their permits, and pollution was in fact going into the waterways. They were sued by Blue Water Baltimore Incorporated, the Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper, and recently Maryland Department of the Environment as well. This is a concern because wastewater sector has been a primary way that Maryland's been meeting its goals for Chesapeake Bay restoration. So any setbacks in this particular sector are a challenge to the overall plan for Chesapeake Bay restoration, at least in terms of Maryland's contribution to it. The other short-term question here is about the Conowingo Dam. The Conowingo Dam Watershed Implementation Plan has been developed, but there's some questions about exactly who's going to be providing the funding for that, whether the partners that are requested to provide funding as part of that Watershed Implementation Plan will actually do so. And while not reflected necessarily here, once again, there is the $25 million in general obligation bond funding in the administration's budget for fiscal 23 to provide for Maryland's contribution. Now, in terms of long-term impacts, there are two that are identified here: the stormwater and septic sectors. Major concern because as we progress, as the population changes over time, increases generally, the wastewater sector will no longer be able to provide for those reductions to help us stay at the Chesapeake Bay total maximum daily load. In effect, our diet will be blown by population increase unless we're able to control the stormwater flows and also septic flows from those two particular sectors. So the question is, will that occur? There have been some challenges in recent years. The stormwater sector has had a lot of work done in terms of stormwater remediation, but it looks like a lot more work needs to be done. It's extremely expensive. And there is some challenges, in particular, at least with Corvias Solutions in Prince George's County, where it has been unable to reach some of the goals and under its municipal separate storm and sewer permit. And so just laying that out there. Also, the biggest long-term concern perhaps is climate change in terms of the impacts from changing rainwater patterns in terms of the timing and also the volume of it. So Chesapeake or Maryland has provided an addendum to its watershed implementation plan to kind of address the impact from climate change. But the overall concern is that it looks like a lot of the way they're hoping to address that is for more performance enhancements from wastewater treatment plants. And as we already discussed, Patapsco and Back River had some challenges. So in that sector, wastewater treatment plants aren't necessarily going to always be able to carry all the slack. And my understanding is that there's some idea also that some of the air programs that have not been potentially factored in as well as they could be, that could also address some of those loads, but the administration need to discuss that more. DLS recommends that the administration comment on how it plans to deal with the short-term impacts at Patapsco and Back River wastewater treatment plant failures and Conowingo Dam watershed implementation plan implementation, and the long-term impacts of growth in stormwater and septic sector nutrient and sediment loadings, and also climate change. And DLS recommends that language be included, requesting a similar report from the agencies for the fiscal 2024 budget submission. The fourth issue concerns the Conowingo Dam. So the dam has been relicensed, although there are lawsuits ongoing related to that. And obviously, the Attorney General has stepped in to address those as well. The Conowingo Dam Watershed Implementation Plan, as we discussed, has been adopted. There is a financing plan in place, and Maryland has provided money in its fiscal 23 budget for the purpose of implementing that plan. Questions are the other jurisdictions doing so as well. And finally, there's the idea of the sediment study for the sediment behind the dam. So the idea was that one of the most effective ways is certainly to reduce the nutrient sediment loading coming down the Susquehanna River that gets filled in behind the dam. But another way to address this is perhaps to also dredge behind the dam, provide more of that capacity. The administration has done a pilot study to actually do some dredging and kind of analyze those sediments. They hope to publish a final version of their report in summer 22 about what they have found. And they've also provided for $6 million for Maryland Environmental Service in fiscal 23 to continue the large-scale dredging project. DLS recommends the administration comment on the likelihood the Chesapeake Bay partners will contribute funding to the Conowingo Dam watershed implementation plan, status of Conowingo Dam relicensing, including the legal challenges that have been raised, and any preliminary findings from the pilot dredging and sediment characterization studies. Fifth and final issue concerns the lawsuits that have been filed against the Environmental Protection Agency. So Maryland's, the Virginia and Washington, D.C. and Delaware as well have filed lawsuits against the Environmental Protection Agency, concern being that primarily that New York and Pennsylvania have not been doing enough to meet the watershed implementation plan requirements. Now, recently, Pennsylvania submitted an amendment to its phase 3 watershed implementation plan on December 31st, 2021. One of the concerns there, though, is that what it looks like they're trying to do is account for many older practices that they've done, but the EPA says is no longer viable. Pennsylvania is trying to say that those practices are still viable, even though it's been many years since they were originally put into place. DLS recommends that the administration comment on the President Joseph R. Biden Jr. administration's plans for regulatory oversight of Chesapeake Bay total maximum daily load. Recommended action is for that language to restrict funding for historical and projected restoration spending for Chesapeake Bay restoration purposes. Unless there are any questions, that concludes the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. Just two quick questions. Page 4, you talked about the legal challenges with the dam, the relicenses, and certification. Could you just comment briefly on, and just for clarity reasons, the continuing legal challenges? What were you referencing?
So one of the concerns about Conowingo Dam relicensing is that the hope was from certain communities to attempt to get the Exelon to pay for a lot more of the work that would be needed to address the Conowingo Dam watershed implementation plan. The idea being that the dam, in a sense, the Exelon owns the nutrients and sediment behind it, and that it's somehow responsible then for also addressing any loading associated with coming into the Chesapeake Bay. The concern was that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission had determined out west in a similar case that the states are not allowed to hold, in a sense, hostage a utility for more than a year in terms of looking at their water quality certification. And Maryland had been challenging for a number of years trying to get an agreement with Exelon, and the consideration was that based on this FERC holding, the possibility was there that Exelon could be completely absolved of any responsibilities whatsoever. Therefore, the administration made an agreement with Exelon for the Conowingo Dam that provides for funding over a number of years, provide for best management practices. The concern by some members that out there, some of the lawsuit participants, is that it didn't go far enough and that the administration could have done more to hold Exelon's feet to the fire in a sense. And that becomes a big question about how FERC would have handled any case had it come before it.
Got it. Fully understand. Page 5, you talk about the Regional Restoration Initiative by the federal government. Was there any type of timeline? I know you commented on it, but did they give expected timeline?
So on page 5, the work, the overall restoration, I'm sorry, could you clarify that for me?
Yep. So you wrote, however, a regional restoration initiative required by the federal government and characterized by accountability measures and short-term program evaluation is underway. Just trying to.
That's the 25 total maximum daily load, and the work, the watershed implementation plans that are being implemented to get to that total maximum daily load. So that's what we're trying to do, what Maryland's trying to do in the other partner states. And so that's the ongoing work that's happening for watershed implementation plans and the 2-year milestones to kind of check up with that. And it looks like if, you know, Maryland continues its progress to date and we can get the wastewater treatment plants up to snuff, that the nitrogen goals potentially could be met by 2025.
Got it. I'm gonna call in the order that I saw them. Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you could focus back on page 3, you mentioned of the results or the challenges with the results from the Corvius Solutions partnership with Prince George's County. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I don't see, or maybe that's for one of the agency reps, but if you could elaborate on that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. So the Corvius Solutions partnership with Prince George's County is a remarkable partnership, a public-private partnership in which Corvius Solutions, a private company, works with Prince George's County to do stormwater remediation work. And it's in line with the work it's also done with the federal government in terms of housing and the military, from what I understand. So the idea is that Corvius Solutions takes on some of the risk, but then is perhaps more nimble and able to then go to the private market and able to kind of get those best management practices in place, perhaps faster than Prince George's County could have done it on its own. Now, that was in principle what was supposed to occur, but to date, it does not look like that's occurred the way everybody had hoped. And so they appear to be behind the timeline that they needed to be meeting their municipal separate stormwater permit. And therefore, while in concept a great idea, the consent decree currently that Maryland Department of Environment has with Prince George's County speaks to the challenges that P3s might be facing in this particular sector.
So if I might, Mr. Chair.
Please.
I guess we can, I'm not sure if MDE is on today, but oh, yes, I see Mr. Rummel's there. I'll wait until he comes up. Thank you.
Got it. Senator Saling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to briefly talk about, and I know firsthand, I've visited back River Restoration, the progress that they're doing, and I know it's an ongoing project that they're doing out there. So I can say that visiting there and some of the things that they're doing in time, I think they're going to get where they need to go for the settlement problems. But my question is that I know they had some studies already from the Conowingo Dam, and I know some of them have gone public, but I know you were talking about dredging. And are all these things that they're going to put in place or what they're going to do, we're going to make sure that all these things are going to be public and people are going to know these firsthand so we can make sure, I mean, there's always, we're looking at accountability, but we're just making sure that people know, the public know these things that are happening. Thank you. Well,
certainly for the $6 million for dredging for the Conowingo Dam, that's the general obligation bonds budgeted in the state budget. And certainly the Department of Legislative Services, and I'm sure the administration as well, will also be providing information. Certainly in spring, summer 2022, Maryland Environmental Service plans to release a study that kind of indicating what their beneficial reuse results have been and what they've been able to do in terms of dredging. And then certainly the Capital Committee, or obviously the Senate as a whole, could put language on the funding, the $6 million for dredging, to request a report to determine how that funding is used and the results that occur from it. And if I could, Mr. Chair, I know our biggest, and one of our biggest concerns have been the Conowingo Dam and the accountability for the other states, being a part of this. I'm hoping we can get somewhere with that. So thank you.
Thank you. Senator Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Drew, I've brought this up over and over again. I didn't mark it down here, but you had these charts on phosphorus and nitrogen, and that it's a chart where Eastern Shore had 7.4% negative, and the western shore was 35 something or other. I go back to my original, you take a little bit in eastern shore, but out in western Maryland, you got a lot of streams and rivers coming out of Pennsylvania into Maryland, then into Potomac River. On the eastern shore, you have some rivers coming out of Delaware into Maryland. How do we know how accurate this is on the Maryland part on these numbers? You know, at one time I'd asked, I forget if it was MD or DNR, to put water monitors in on the border, so we knew what the water was like coming across the border, and one where it goes into the Potomac, so we know what it was like there. So then you could get a better handle, you know, are we being credited appropriately, for a better way to say it, and these reductions. How do we know that our reductions just for the Maryland parts not more than what you have on that chart?
So the reductions are done by basin. From what I understand, the basins do track the watersheds. So they should be reflecting just, I mean, in terms of Maryland as a whole, Maryland is a political boundary. That's different from the watersheds that are in Maryland and then kind of maybe extend out of Maryland. But there is monitoring to determine how much nutrients and sediment are coming from out of state. And perhaps the administration could speak more directly to kind of any cross-border concerns that there might be.
Well, we have, you know, in Western Maryland, you got the Monocacy, you got the Conowingo, you got Wills Creek, which are pretty large streams or rivers. And I just want to make sure that all this effort we're putting in, we're getting the accurate accreditations for what we're doing, because you got they start in Pennsylvania and come out. So you know some of this stuff's coming from Pennsylvania into Maryland and then into the Potomac. And we're doing a lot more than they are. You don't have that in Virginia or West Virginia because they're not coming through Maryland. We have a little bit on the eastern shore. I just think we need to make sure we're getting appropriate credit for the percentage of reduction that's going into the Chesapeake Bay, if I'm making any sense there.
That makes sense. One thing to kind of I can bring up, I guess, is the Western Shore progress to date is the wastewater treatment plants largely, and the upgrades that have occurred through the Bay Restoration Fund to enhance nutrient removal technology. On the Eastern Shore, it's much more dispersed agricultural reduction, and that's not permitted and is more challenging from a policy perspective. But certainly the administration perhaps can speak more to making sure that we're getting credit for everything that we're doing.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned to you, I do have another meeting. I'll probably get off here about 1:15. But if someone from one of the departments can answer that better maybe than I asked the question, might be helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Edwards. At this moment, I'd like to call up our agency heads. I'm going to start with Secretary McCord. I do see Secretary Hadaway Riccio. I also see Secretary Bartenfelder, and I also see Secretary Grumbles. Whoever's leading.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to take the opportunity, particularly before Senator Edwards departs for another meeting, to take the lead on this. I'm lucky to serve as the chair of the governor's Chesapeake Bay cabinet. And I'm joined by several of the cabinet members on the Chesapeake Bay. Secretary Riccio also represents the governor and the very important Chesapeake Bay Commission efforts, and Secretary Bartenfelder and Secretary McCord. I have a few opening comments, but before we get to your specific questions, and it's more of a response. It's hard not to try to chime in on all the comprehensive overview and dialogue between members and the excellent Andrew Gray. Senator Edwards, one of the priorities for us, particularly with a new EPA in place, a new regional administrator, is to emphasize that as Maryland is a downstream and downwind state, every state needs to do its fair share. And if MDE or DNR is not monitoring every potential border, pollution, doesn't respect political boundaries, we need EPA to be monitoring those and to take that into account in the overall pollution diet for the Chesapeake Bay. And so on that front, we're engaged with the new administration in Virginia because of sewage spills into the Potomac River. And we certainly, as you've highlighted, there are issues that can happen with respect to the Potomac River. We're following that closely, and we will provide more information for you after this meeting on the effort that the governor puts a priority on, and that is for every state to do its fair share and to show leadership. And speaking of the leadership point, I just wanted to emphasize, Mr. Chairman, in this opportunity for us to brief you all and answer your questions. We're very proud of the fact that in terms of the budget, our state continues to put its money where its mouth is and its environmental leadership for the Chesapeake Bay. One of the items I definitely wanted to highlight, particularly while all the members are here, is that we have been working very hard not only to ensure our state meets its commitments for the WIP. Each state has to develop a watershed implementation plan to get to a point where we're making real progress by 2025. That's the requirement in the TMDL and the Clean Water Act. But that we also focus in on that and continue to make progress on that front, but also focus on climate change and also on one of the biggest gaps that will determine our success or not, and that's the Conowingo Susquehanna River pollution. And so I'll get into it that in terms of the questions, Q's and A's, but I wanted to highlight right at the outset that the governor sees the multi-state partnership effort on the Conowingo watershed implementation plan to deal with the pollution coming from New York and even more so from Pennsylvania and to some degree from Maryland too, that backs up behind the dam and can't all be put on the responsibility of the owner of the dam, that the states really have to step up. And that led to that WIP, which we finalized, but now we need to fund it. And the governor included $25 million. This is an unprecedented step to show statesmanship and also a real and important initiative. And I look forward with my colleagues from the Bay Cabinet to briefing you and other policymakers, leaders in the legislature on how that 25 million should translate into Pennsylvania matching it, and also the federal government stepping up, because this is a national treasure, and putting real money into cost-effective, pay-for-performance, public-private partnerships with real public accountability. Now, I just want to emphasize when we talk about the Chesapeake Bay, one of the most important components is making real progress on our WIP, our phase 3 WIP. And that means that this plan, this blueprint, which we are tracking and following and making progress, we're on track largely. It's locally driven, it's focused on what's achievable, and it's balanced among the different sectors: agriculture, municipal wastewater, stormwater, septic systems. Plus, the MDE committed to making sure that we make real progress in air quality. We are a downwind state, and so we have sued Pennsylvania. We have pressed the federal government to put in more controls to reduce that atmospheric nitrogen coming from smokestacks and tailpipes outside of the state that threaten the bay. But with respect to the bay progress, we're making key progress. I'm going to get into those questions about the lawsuit against EPA and pressing forward on some of the key problems and increasing climate resiliency. But I do want to underscore that with the other members of the cabinet here, I'm going to turn to them. I'll turn to Secretary Bartenfelder first to give some remarks he might like to, and specifically, Joe, if you could respond to the first question about the cover crop, the DLS question about cover crops.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and I'm going to give some brief remarks, and actually Hans Schmidt, our Assistant Secretary, is going to respond to the cover crop question. But thank you, Mr. Chair and committee members. It's a pleasure to be with you here today, even though it's virtually. Much rather be there in person to see you, and we'll do that soon, I hope. The Maryland Department of Agriculture has adapted to the challenges that COVID has brought on in order to meet the commitment to achieving the 2025 Chesapeake Bay water quality goals set by the EPA. The health of the Chesapeake Bay and its tributaries is a top priority for MDA. We have progressive farmers here in Maryland who lead the country with the use of nutrient management, conservation, best management practices to protect the water quality, reduce soil erosion, and improve soil health. However, it is important to recognize that Maryland farmers are competing with farmers across the country that may not face some of the same regulatory challenges we do here. With this in mind, we must continue to support our local farmers to ensure a viable and sustainable agriculture industry in Maryland. I'm happy to say that we're succeeding with meeting those challenges. Despite COVID-19 and the job market challenges, MDA has administered 4 different recruitments to fill 53 positions across the state for our soil conservation districts, providing the best customer service to our farmers and addressing their resource concerns. Following 7 years of hard work and perseverance, Maryland's phosphorus management tool, the PMT regulations, were fully implemented on July 1st, 2021, as recommended by the PMT Advisory Committee. We also continue to evaluate our programs to incentivize the adoption of additional conservation on agricultural land. Last spring, Governor Hogan signed a new law that authorized the program to provide up to 100% cost share for more than 20 high priority conservation practices. As a result of the pandemic, our conservation grants program implemented temporary measures to account for escalating material costs to provide farmers some relief. The Soil Health Advisory Committee just approved recommendations to the department this past week, and I look forward to moving our commitment to soil health and sustainability across our great state. Finally, we must ensure that we're addressing the needs of all of our agriculture producers throughout the state, rural or urban alike, whether a half acre or 10,000 acres in size. We remain committed to assisting and helping farmers, protecting our environment while providing solutions to keep their farms strong and viable. This time I'll turn to Assistant Secretary Hans Schmidt, who will talk about the first issue on cover crops.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The first question, our question was answered that how the department, the possibility of outcome-based payment system for the cover crop program. The department is engaged in looking at new enhancements to our current cover crop program. We're trying to get a better understanding of outcome enhanced or performance in, outcomes for cover crops, particularly in non-point source practices. So as our commitment is to develop a pilot this year, offering some matrix to improving soil health, like multi-species tillage options and so forth. The one thing I would like to mention is that we are committed to looking at a pay for performance practice, and we're focusing on agricultural drainage filter practices. We're working on that pilot and hopefully have that introduced this year. So thank you.
Now we'll turn to Secretary Riccio. Is that correct? Yeah.
Go ahead, Jeannie.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. For the record, Jeannie Hadaway Riccio, Secretary of the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and we're grateful for the opportunity to be here today with our colleagues from the Bay Cabinet to highlight some programs and initiatives related to our progress on the Chesapeake Bay. One of the best and most notable ways, of course, that we can engage citizens in Chesapeake Bay restoration and really inspire the next generation of stewards is through experiences that connect people with our natural resources. So we're really pleased to highlight the land conservation programs in Maryland. For the 5th year in a row, the state budget fully funds all of the transfer tax programs, including program open space. And it also includes a repayment of program open space in the amount of $30.5 million. The budget for our department also provides nearly $75 million for the Maryland Park Service, which is a 20-year high, and $750,000 for the newly formed Office of Outdoor Recreation. To address our TMDL goals, it's of paramount importance that we continue to work together to conserve, protect, and restore both our landscapes and our waterways. And the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays Trust Fund is one of our state's most effective resources in that effort. The structure of that grant program allows us to identify the most cost-effective projects with the highest pollution reduction outcomes for our state. And over the coming year, we will continue to incorporate resiliency in our restoration efforts through that program to ensure that the progress that we're making to date is not lost over time. So through the support of the governor and the Maryland General Assembly with the Trust Fund, we've now completed more than 3,000 projects, developed 42 new restoration technologies, and seen innovative and public-private partnerships formed. And we really believe that the Trust Fund is an example for the nation of how state funding can be used strategically to have measurable impacts. So it's absolutely imperative to retain this funding in order for us to meet our goals for 2025 and beyond. And so you may ask, how do we know that? It's really based on the monitoring and the long-term data that we collect. So in part to answer Senator Edwards' question, Senator, at your behest, we did add some additional stream monitors, and we have been collecting data that we would be happy to share with you. And also, I think it's just important to make a distinction between the model that's used by the Chesapeake Bay program that's showing what happens on the land and that water quality monitoring data that we collect. But our water quality monitoring system has been internationally recognized as one of the best and most important tools to measure our success. Given the important role that agriculture and local jurisdictions play in Chesapeake Bay restoration, I do think it's worth noting that the Trust Fund supports Maryland farmers and Maryland communities with technical assistance and best management practices that help us achieve our goal. So our department is really proud to partner with all of our Bay Cabinet agencies, including the Maryland Department of Planning. And I'm going to use that as a segue to introduce Secretary Rob Mccord.
Thank you, Secretary Riccio. It's Rob Mccord, for the record, the Secretary of the Department of Planning. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the subcommittee. As you know, planning finished the big process called the census. Now we're doing the process of digesting those numbers and trying to see what those numbers tell us. Since that was a little bit late, the Census Bureau itself will be sending out its American Community Survey information later than normal. But we've been taking a look at what's happening in the census tracts in the entire Conowingo watershed also. So that watershed is important to us. We have people in the data center keeping an eye on that for us. And at planning, on the planning side, of course, we're trying to continue our work with local governments to make sure that we incentivize growth in the priority funding areas. That's generally where the water and sewer is already located. So that population inside the PFAs is about 85%. So to Senator Edwards' comment about Virginia and Pennsylvania, just looking at population numbers, it appears that that's about 60% of the population of the watershed, Virginia and Pennsylvania. So we understand that. We're taking a look at that. We have to understand that there was population change in Maryland that went up by about 7%, but in 7 counties, that was population that was a decrease. 7 counties saw decreases in population. So we're trying to figure that into what this means going forward. What it is, we know at the moment. What it means, we're going to study with our other Bay Cabinet partners. The COVID pandemic, of course, has most of the demographic literature. The writers are saying that there will be no baby boom like people think happens after blizzards and snowstorms. There's actually kind of a baby bust that they've been writing about, that people have been delaying decisions to have the next child or a child to begin with. And that's going to put a dent in the population projections. And that's going to show up in our schools in about 5 years from now. So we're keeping close eye on what's happening with the population, looking at what the demographers have been writing about, and looking at our own numbers as best we can. So we, at this point, continue to be partners with our other agencies to make sure that they can rely upon us and that they can rely upon us to supply basically valuable information and cross-check each other about what we think is happening here in this watershed. So we'll continue to be a resource for all of the Bay Cabinet agencies. So I'll just turn it back to Secretary Grumbles.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob. Mr. Chairman, I'm just going to go through the remaining questions that were teed up for us to answer. There are 4 other questions, and then we can get into the Q&A, which is wonderful.
That would be perfect.
If that's okay. Question number 2, since Secretary Bartenfelder answered question number 1, on question 2, the answer is that we certainly will continue to provide the requested data, Chesapeake Bay Restoration funding data, including the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays 2010 Trust Fund annual report, which Jeannie is so proud of, along with the governor's fiscal 2024 allowance. Now, question number 3, historical and projected Chesapeake Bay Restoration spending report. It tees up questions about phase 3 WIP implementation and progress on important issues. We will continue to provide the requested data and reporting, including materials that are responsive to enter any future DLS reporting requests. Now, regarding the Baltimore wastewater treatment plants, the Back River and the Patapsco, we are taking legal action against the city. There's a false narrative that's been created that we would not have taken action had it not been for the prompting of a very important partner in the NGO community, Blue Water Baltimore. The fact of the matter is that we rely on the eyes and ears of citizen groups always. Blue Water Baltimore helped bring more information to the table for us. We agreed. We have been working closely with the city of Baltimore as we developed our lawsuit, our case, and as well as including Blue Water Baltimore. So the fact that they filed a lawsuit and then we filed a lawsuit, what it really means is the state of Maryland is putting a priority on increasing the accountability and making sure that these 2 world-class facilities are brought back on track. And that means working with the city, not just providing funding, which we've done over the years of federal and state funding over $1 billion. It's making sure that those facilities are optimized, that they're more certified operators, that they are not violating MDE's permits. So that's a very important step. And it's so important because if we don't ensure progress at those world-class facilities, then we would fall behind and not be on track to meet our commitments for the Chesapeake Bay. So that's a really important step. And we have the full support of the Attorney General, and we filed that lawsuit. And I'm optimistic we're going to get those facilities back in compliance and work closely with the city for continued proper maintenance of those important facilities. Now, with respect to the Conowingo, a couple things. One is you asked, Mr. Chairman, a very important question. It gets a lot of attention about litigation over the Conowingo settlement and specifically the litigation, which is now in the courts over where environmental groups have sued the federal government. FERC included the settlement agreement that MDE reached with Exelon that provides over $200 million in new environmental and ecosystem commitments. We're moving forward on that front, but recognize that that settlement, that historic settlement, did not please everyone. Some wanted more, Some wanted specifically a big dredging project. We worked as hard as we could. We convinced FERC that we use science and law and that the settlement, it was folded into the FERC license, but we'll stay engaged and see what happens at the federal level. We're focused on the other components. One is to implement that settlement, that $200 million that FERC is providing over years. That includes over $11 million upfront for that we're seeking public comment on and engaging with environmental groups and communities to provide unprecedented and badly needed investments in the ecosystem restoration, from freshwater mussels to BMPs, best management practices to reduce nutrient pollution upstream and behind the dam and in Maryland waters. And that's with Exelon money. The big part of it that Andrew Gray highlighted is that we reached agreement after 2.5 years with the other states in the Bay watershed and the federal government that the Conowingo Susquehanna River needs to be treated almost like a jurisdiction in and of itself, like all the other states have to develop watershed implementation plans. Let's develop one that has federal support, federal funding, state support, state funding, and takes into account that 6 million pounds of nitrogen that is leaking continuously passed through the Conowingo Dam because the reservoir behind it is essentially filled up. We've made real progress on that front, but we didn't have the funding for it, and the governor included as the lead state to get the ball moving in $25 million in this year's budget, and that $25 million will be to jumpstart this innovative effort of finance authority that the Susquehanna River Basin Commission would oversee for projects on agricultural lands, on suburban lands, in the Susquehanna River watershed, in Maryland, in Pennsylvania, in New York, to the benefit of the Susquehanna River and the Chesapeake Bay. So we're really excited about that, as we are the $6 million the governor included in the budget. It'll go directly to MES to go beyond the pilot study on dredging and beneficial reuse, to significantly expand the knowledge and the market base for beneficial reuse of clean sediment, to shore up the land, to be used in other ways, but to get it out of the river and out of the Chesapeake Bay. That's an ongoing effort. So that's a very important perspective on with respect to growth. The projected growth out to 2025 is included in Maryland's 2025 plan, and Secretary Cord is very capable of going into more details on that. But our phase 3 WIP, which is code for our blueprint for where we need to get to 2025 and beyond, factors in pollution reduction and minimization programs, land conservation and land preservation programs in place, and environmental site design and priority funding areas and open space, program open space that DNR is proud of and all of us benefit from, to forest conservation and critical area requirements. You asked about I'm almost done, Mr. Chairman, with this. You asked about DLS asked about the climate change addendum. In other words, how does our blueprint take into account that this region is going to get warmer and wetter, and some parts of the bay will get saltier. Some of them will, particularly the northern portion of the bay, will have more freshwater infusions because of all the storms. How do we factor in the increased runoff and precipitation? So we have, as we committed to, factored in climate change conditions for additional reductions in nutrient and sediment runoff. We describe in the climate addendum how optimizing performance at wastewater treatment plants can provide the necessary short-term reductions that are needed. We've also absolutely read the writing on the wall that when it comes to stormwater, one of the biggest challenges for the Bay, and that's true in Maryland as well, not just Virginia and Pennsylvania or other states, we are committed to in updating our precipitation models, factoring in more resilient, durable strategies for stormwater and flooding. That's a really important development, and more briefings for you and your colleagues are going to be about how are we factoring in resiliency for stormwater and nature-based solutions to increase the filtration of the pollution from when it rains. Last question, specifically I touched on already, which was the Conowingo Dam relicensing and the watershed implementation plan and the sedimentation study. I'll just simply, I won't repeat everything I just said. I'll say we've answered that and provided that information in writing, but specifically on the pilot dredging and sediment characterization work, which Maryland Environmental Service will take the lead on. We did accomplish a significant project. We put $3 million into the dredging of 253 million. We're studying the estimated 253 million total cubic yards in the Maryland portion of the Conowingo Reservoir. We found that there was some coal sand and fine particle pollution in that, but that there's some great opportunities for beneficial reuse and innovative use of those materials. But more specifics, more details are in the written response. The dredging pilot was successfully completed, and we look forward to going beyond the pilot to more opportunities to grow the market, to reduce the cost of dredging and have a beneficial reuse for ecosystem restoration and water quality enhancements. And then lastly, the question is about what about the lawsuit against the EPA? Governor Hogan directed the Attorney General to file a lawsuit against EPA. This was during the Trump administration because the EPA, to our severe disappointment, did not step up and show they would be an honest interstate umpire and call Pennsylvania out on the fact that they had a $324 million gap in their Chesapeake Bay blueprint, their phase 3 WIP. Admittedly had a gap on how much they would be reducing that they had previously committed to. Where we are in that litigation is with the change in administration over the and particularly over the last several weeks with the new regional administrator on board. We're seeing signs that EPA is now serious about meeting and getting into the specifics of what Maryland, Virginia, the District of Columbia, and Delaware have been asking for, for more regulatory backstops, more accountability to make sure that Pennsylvania's failure to meet its commitments doesn't provide a failure for the whole Chesapeake Bay. So we're in the midst of those discussions. We'll keep you up to speed as things progress. But that's one of our top priorities as a state, is making sure that we get stronger accountability. And it's not just about funding, more funding, it's about accountability as well to ensure that Pennsylvania and New York do their fair share. And on that note, I just wanted to say on funding, I'm glad that Andrew Gray highlighted that one of Governor Hogan's legislative priority principles that he communicated to President Ferguson on October 1 was for the legislature again to move forward with a comprehensive Conservation Finance Act, because that is needed to supplement the public funding, not in lieu of, but we really need innovative public-private partnerships and private capital, tremendous opportunities, not just in the Susquehanna River watershed, but throughout the Bay for a pay for performance and kind of like Corvius in Prince George's, but also throughout the Bay so that more money is put into nature-based solutions environmental, social governance policies in the private sector are going to lead to more dollars where companies are going to want to put money that's well managed, publicly accountable into restoring the bay. And we think that that can significantly supplement our public efforts and funding. And the very last item was to ask to respond to the following recommendation. There's one recommendation that's provided, and that is to add budget bill language on historical and projected Chesapeake Bay restoration funding, including $1 million in restricted funding pending submission of the report by December 1, 2022. As we've demonstrated over the last several years, we have submitted comprehensive, I think, thoughtful, strategic, detailed reports by December 1. So we will continue to meet that time frame. We do respectfully disagree with the need to restrict $1 million in funding pending submission of the report. But that concludes my lengthy answers to your questions and recommendations, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to turn it back to you for questions or comments you and your colleagues would like to make to the Bay Cabinet members.
Thank you, Secretary Grumbles. I'm gonna go to Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Grumbles posed a question to Mr. Gray regarding the Corvius Solutions P3 partnership with Bruce County, and it was mentioned, I think it was on page 3 of his presentation, talked about it spoke of the consent decree with the county. We believe in P3 partnerships. However, could you speak to the challenges there and a timeline on reaching a solution? So if Prince George's entered into this partnership and what that means going forward to ensure that we are meeting the needs that we're trying to get to.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I know from my first day as being able to serve as the Secretary of the Environment in Maryland, I've been touting and just about everyone else has been touting this partnership in Prince George's with Corvius. So no issue with that. The issue we had, which led MDE to sue the county, was over their failure to meet the commitments that they had made in their MS4 permit, their municipal separate storm sewer permit. They didn't make the progress that they had signed up for as a matter of law. So we felt it was important to bring an enforcement action against them. That led to a consent agreement that we signed off on that committed them to do more and to put specific investments in places and to provide a penalty, which could also be substituted for in kind for various projects. But it was important for us to hold them accountable in that. And I feel like that was a very good outcome, and it sends a signal to others that when you have a permit and you don't meet the timeline or the obligations in your permit, despite the best of your intentions, there's still accountability. Now, we are also, we've been very clear to the county that they need funding for flooding and stormwater projects. So we're fully supportive of that. But we also feel it's important for their county, like other large counties, to have a new MS4, another municipal separate storm sewer permit. So we're in the process of proposing that. But I hope that answers your question.
It does, Mr. Secretary. And if you could, if at all possible, submit not only to me, but to the members, the document.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to follow that as we progress.
Thank you. We think it's a good opportunity to keep working with the county and making progress on green infrastructure, environmental justice, and meet our Chesapeake Bay commitments.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Salem.
I want to thank all the secretaries, administration for all the information that was handed to us. But I think one of my concerns, and I think it's a lot of concerns of a lot of our constituents, is the Conowingo Dam. And we've talked about like best management practices and things that we're trying to do in the state of Maryland. And we know the lawsuit is there also. But in the lawsuit itself or in other ways, are we finding out, or are we going to find out in time? Or these other states like Pennsylvania, New York, are we finding out they are trying to do maybe better or best managed practices or other things to make a difference? So as I know we are, the state of Maryland's doing this. I think we've been responsible, but are we going to make sure in time and in the future that they will be doing the same? Thank you.
Yeah, and I would thank you, Senator. I'll just I want to re-emphasize, and I know from the Hogan administration's perspective, the governors, that we are going to hold Exelon accountable to what they legally agreed upon, included in both the federal license and in the state settlement and contractual agreement. But that's clearly not enough. That's why we have the watershed implementation plan that we finalized, but that hasn't gotten out of the starting blocks yet, because there was a question about, well, how much are states going to put into this? And that's why the governor put 25 million to show Maryland is really committed. Let's have other states match that and the federal government step up. I am seeing signs, where the state, Pennsylvania in particular, is committing. They submitted a revised watershed implementation plan, which is separate from the Conowingo WIP and can sometimes cause confusion. But they did submit a revised watershed implementation plan to EPA where they say they're going to do more, which would benefit the Susquehanna River and could help contribute to the solutions that are caused by the Conowingo Dam problem. But I would say that Maryland and other states are communicating to the US EPA that is absolutely not sufficient, that Pennsylvania's revised Phase 3 WIP still has a big gap. There's still a need for increased accountability. And as the governor demonstrated in his budget with 25 million for this Conowingo watershed implementation plan, we need the other states and particularly the federal government to step up and put more money into that innovative public-private finance authority model. So we're keeping our eyes on it and recognize our work isn't done yet, Senator.
Thank you. I'm just hoping that our federal partners and the governors and all those that are in other states are working together to make that difference.
We're trying to convince Virginia because of the new change in administration to make sure that they keep sight of the fact that Chesapeake Bay health depends on real progress and leadership in the Susquehanna River, and that includes the Conowingo problem. So that's, I think, really important, but getting help from the federal government and from the environmental community to focus on real solutions for the Susquehanna and the Conowingo and move forward, it continues to be a priority for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions, just wanted to first lift up Andrew Gray. Mr. Gray, just thank you for your diligent service in reference to your report, very detailed. Just wanted to lift up Secretary Grumbles and all of the Chesapeake Bay cabinet. Just thank you all for your leadership and what you're doing to move Maryland forward. We know that Chesapeake Bay is one of our greatest treasures in the state of Maryland, and thankful that we can keep it that way. Colleagues, this looks like it ends our first hearing of PSTE. Look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow. It sounds like 11:30. Y'all have a blessed day.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.